So yes, welcome back everyone. I'm going to get our welcome back screen up here. Okay. So for this, in the end bit, we're going to have a discussion. We can kind of debrief as a big group, but in the interest of time and our size right now, we're going to kind of keep moving. But if there are things that were really great that were discussed, I think we would all love to benefit from that. So if there were some discussions, some takeaways you want to share, you can throw them in the chat. Ellen will be looking at the chat because I can't multitask that well. So, and then, again, we have a lot of other channels that we can continue to have these discussions. Particularly, this is a really great, I have gotten lots of emails from people who are apologizing for not being able to attend in person, which I feel like speaks to our very ingrained sense of like classes are at a time when we have to be there. And I think it's good for us all to start thinking about what it means to have a synchronous and asynchronous learning experience as well, because that is something that we're going to have to be thinking about. That it's perfectly okay to not be able to. People had things, I got several emails about I had an emergency come up, I had to go to the dentist, and as much as like it's nice to get a heads up, I guess, but there isn't an expectation that people can make the synchronous time, because that is part of doing a flexible online class that is going to be accessible for all of our students. So I think this is, I think it's good for us to get used to that from our end of things, because we can maybe help share those norms and kind of create those norms for our classes. So anyway, share stuff if you want, or put them online in other capacities. Moving forward here. So some of this is going to be stuff people know, and for people who have been doing assorted pedagogy trainings, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about today, we're going to be kind of pivoting to what does this look like in an online environment. But that still, I think it is best practices pedagogically to also make sure that we are not assuming that people know things and then a third of our class is just left out of stuff. So I know I try in my classes to, do we all know what assessment means? Is it the same as grading? Let's just make sure we're all on the same page, as opposed to assuming that we all share some basic knowledge that we maybe don't. So does grading equal assessment? And there are a lot of resources in the notes for all of these if you've downloaded the slides, if you want to know more about these things. I hope Nick doesn't mind that I am sharing. He shared this in Discord, so I assumed it was probably fair game to share here. There's been some really good conversations going on about ungrading, and if you look down here, some of those resources, including a really nice kind of step-by-step process that Nick laid out and has shared as a Google Doc about his process. And this was something that he implemented in this last semester. And we kind of talked about feeling like maybe in normal situations, we don't all feel like we can move towards ungrading. But in a crisis, that gave him kind of that motivation or that comfort level to try this out. So anyway, before I jump down there, the main difference here that we're talking about grading is about evaluating. Have they learned X, right? There's going to be some benchmark, some standard that we might be comparing a student to. Do they know, I don't know, all of Newton's laws of thermodynamics? Do they know the equation for X? Can they apply this formula? Whereas assessment is oriented at improving student learning. They can work together, but grading does not necessarily improve student learning. And so there are a variety of different ungraded assessments. A lot of people move towards a very loose grading way. So a check, check plus, check minus, done or not done, things like that. And then another thing that I've been really enjoying following some conversations on the Discord platform is people talking about ways that it's sort of collaborative, working with students to think about what grades might look like, what the criteria might look like. So there's been some really, really interesting conversations going on around that. Assessments. So we generally split this up into formative assessments and summative assessments. Formative assessments are ones that are about forming. So these are the kind of to monitor learning. I'll have some examples on the next slide, but they're about monitoring learning as opposed to evaluating learning. And so it gives us a chance, and a lot of times, more importantly, it gives the students a chance to see what they have and haven't learned. So a lot of times a quiz is nice for us to know if our students have memorized what they're supposed to memorize or they can apply what they're supposed to apply. But it's really good for students to see if they are just staring at a list of vocabulary and they think they've learned it, but until they're asked to produce it and to generate it, they maybe don't know what they aren't retaining as well as they thought they were. So it's a chance both for students to monitor their own learning and for us to monitor their learning. Helps students assess strengths and weaknesses, helps faculty recognize where students need more support, as opposed to the summative assessment, right? These are generally very high stakes at the end of a unit, and this is often comparing to some kind of benchmark. So you could think about our AP exams, and sometimes these are necessary, right? Like I think I generally very much prefer formative assessments, but there are times when a summative assessment is going to be necessary, especially if you're teaching students in some kind of prepping for a particular exam in a field where you have to pass a certifying exam, a board exam, something like that. Comparing to a benchmark is important. For classes that take a certain standardized national exam at the end of the semester, the end of the school year, these are important. But thinking about the difference between them is going to really help us think a little bit more detailed and critically about what assessments are supposed to be doing. And then you can also have things that are kind of in between these two. But if we just want to think about this in a binary sense, formative assessments are going to be these kind of low stakes discussions, reading responses, summaries, case studies, things like this, as opposed to the summative assessments are these big kind of final projects. They go at the end of a unit, they go at the end of a chapter, end of a class, kind of the final essay, etc. And then I want to talk quickly about, and there's some good resources there, but another thing talking kind of goes within this category of assessments is talking about authentic assessment. And so this is literally just taken from the link that's in the notes for this slide, if you have those handy. So thinking about authentic assessments are ones that ask students to apply in some meaningful way. So when we're thinking about our learning objectives, our learning outcomes, really thinking about why do I want my students to be able to do this? And if there is a particular kind of real world, and I generally hate that acting as though school is not part of our students and our real worlds, but if there's a particular actual application as opposed to something we made up for the purposes of our class. So this might be changing an essay, an academic essay, into a format that an op-ed, something like that, where if you want your students to be orienting themselves towards some different audience as opposed to writing a one-off essay that I will read and I will give them a grade and we will never think about it again. So anyway, if this is not something you are familiar with, I would really recommend authentic assessment is a good thing to think about. And then online assessment. Not everyone's going to agree with me on some of these things. I will say I love and have been regularly sharing this essay called Against Cop Shit by Jeffrey Morrow. I would recommend you read it. Not everyone is going to take, this is in education, this is a somewhat more extreme stance. But this gets into, when we think about online assessments, one of the big things that we're talking about is, our students might cheat. If they take an exam, what are we going to do if they cheat on that exam? And I would personally, I think that is a bad approach to coming towards our students, coming towards learning and teaching. So what he describes as cop shit is things that presume an adversarial relationship, things that assume that we need to catch them. They are going to try and break the classroom laws and we need to be there to catch and punish our students, as opposed to thinking about a more constructive and productive relationship between us. This is not going to say that students are not going to cheat sometimes, but that's not unique to an online environment. And I would really, on this topic, I would really recommend Cheating Lessons, which talks a lot about if you have well-designed assessments, things that tap into more intrinsic motivation as opposed to reusing the same tests, reusing the same essay prompts because you don't want to reproduce any material, things that are just asking, what are 3 ways that Caesar brought about the downfall of the Roman Republic, something like that. That is sending a message that you haven't really cared that much if you're just reusing your essay prompt every year. and it is easy to cheat on those kind of things. Whereas having assignments that are asking students to reflect specifically on their personal discussions they've been having in class, it's really hard to cheat on a more creative, more intrinsically motivated assessment. Because if you are supposed to incorporate conversations you've been having with your classmates, you can't really steal that from somewhere. And students are going to be more invested in those assignments. So anyway, loved cheating lessons, highly recommend that. These are some examples, and these are, I'm just showing this kind of as a teaser for the link that is below, which is talking about in the notes section there, and it's available on the website as well. Formative assessment, formative and summative. So I mentioned we kind of have those two categories, but also there is like a combined middle ground there. And summative assessment, these are all things that are very accessible in an online format. So some of this is going to be just a technological thing. Discussion boards, quizzes, things like that. So there are the technological limitations, and then there are what is actually going to advance learning objectives that are appropriate for an online or quasi-online environment. Couple more, these are all just stolen from that same website that's in the bottom, but so if we want to go back to the Bloom taxonomy, which we looked at earlier, here are some online suitable assessment options. So if we want to assess knowledge, right, having assorted different types of quizzes, and the internet is very good for quizzes. There are a million platforms that can do a lot of our work for us in terms of helping us see how students are doing, managing their results, giving students feedback. The internet is very good for quizzing, and I'm sure everyone has their favorite Quizlet or whatever, Kahoot, all of these different platforms that are really well designed for knowledge assessment. Comprehension is going to be, as we start to move up, which is not entirely helpfully, maybe helpfully arranged and going down on this chart, but possibly it gets us away from thinking, as people were mentioning in the chat earlier, that knowledge is a bad learning outcome. That should be deprioritized. But thinking about these all work in tandem, right? So just because some involve more complex, higher order kind of thought process doesn't mean that there is necessarily, like, we don't care about the knowledge level in Bloom's taxonomy. So a lot of options here. And then the last thing I want to, Ellen mentioned this before we go back to breakout rooms to actually try applying some of this stuff. Ellen mentioned alignment, and it's kind of this process of going from our learning outcomes to what kinds of evidence do we want, and how are we going to see, how are we going to assess that evidence of what our students are learning. And so this is an example of, this is just taken from a version of the matrix that, and I will share this link in the chat as well, but I emailed this out to everybody, an alignment matrix. I think this is a really useful way. I will say the first time I was asked to do one of these, I was like, this is dumb and feels very touchy-feely, and I don't think I should have to do this. It actually is, I found it to be super useful. So as someone who has really come around on a lot of these things that I thought were, I don't know, I was not super on board with at an earlier stage in my development as a teacher and student. I think these are really useful. So this was for a class on Greek tragedy and that I was developing as a graduate student. And this was the first one I did. I include it because it needed some work. So this is, you know, I think this is a useful way of thinking about a first pass that needed some work here. But learning goal or objective. I wanted my students to develop the skills necessary to discuss and develop evidence-based arguments about drama and multimodal texts. Little jargony, but it gets the point across. My assessment activity, one of the things that I was thinking about was ungraded discussion-based assignments. So what are those going to look like? How am I going to, what types of assessments would be appropriate? Throw out some ideas here, short answer questions, students complete, asking students to generate their own discussion questions, creative assignments, and these all being ungraded or kind of done or not done, graded more on completeness than anything else. And then the instructional activity. And this is kind of this last step that we haven't talked about a ton yet. And if you don't get to this column, perfectly fine for this next breakout group. But instructional activity, okay, so like what things am I going to do as a teacher with, if this is my learning goal, this is the assessments that I'm going to use to see if my students are getting towards that learning goal, and then what exactly will the methods or strategies that I'm going to use. So this is, I would say, as an example, this is the place that I think that my original matrix did not do super well. I don't think assigned readings is necessarily the best way to get my students to these learning goals. But thinking about, so this is kind of an example of where one might go with this kind of example, this kind of exercise. So I will share in the chat a link to the document, but you don't have to use it in depending on how your discussions are going. But we're going to go into breakout groups again. And so for those learning objectives that hopefully we discussed and formulated in the previous session, either start working on an alignment matrix or just kind of brainstorm, think through in these different categories. What kind of tasks will reveal whether students have achieved your learning objectives? How are you going to measure? We hopefully got those learning objectives that are measurable, specific, measurable, 3 other letters that Michelle shared that make up SMART, timely, and something else. So if we have good learning objectives, what kind of tasks will reveal that? And thinking specifically about things that would be appropriate in an online environment. So there are things that we can't assess as well if we aren't in person. So thinking a little bit specifically in that online environment. And then if you have time, thinking about what teaching methods or strategies will you use to get there. We will spend about 5-ish minutes just so that we can end on time. For folks who can stick around for the next half-hour session, we'll be digging in a little bit more deeply, and just to give you a sense of where we can go if you stick around. The other form that I shared via email on my second try of emailing y'all last night was a feedback form. So just a way to look at what someone else has produced, if they have produced that alignment matrix, and say like, okay, how well do I think it does all of these things? So without any further ado, I am going to put people in some new breakout rooms.